Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Get Out of Jail Free Radio Hour. I am your host and guide, Mr. Crispy, speaking to you through uncanny frequencies and sharing with you stories strange, fascinating, and terrifying. The views and opinions expressed on air are solely those of the speaker. The Get Out of Jail Free Radio Hour is an entertainment program, and any similarities to any person living or dead, or any place or events, are entirely coincidental. The Get Out of Jail Free Radio Hour was created except as indicated by Matt Henshaw. Listener discretion is advised. And now, take Mr. Crispy's moldering hand in yours, ignore that tacky fluid under my nails, and join me for the Get Out of Jail Free Radio Hour. Hypoxic rotations swirl eddies behind your sleeping eyes. Truths unscorched and flames dance in film reverse saturation until the heat blisters the nitrate to blooming and you awake. From the other room, you hear your partner listening to music they don't usually listen to. You recognize it as Haunted Chapel, a progressive metal act with a small but devoted following. Your partner does not follow them, though. You unwind your still half-asleep legs from the covers and make your way tilting out of the chamber. Turning the corner, you're surprised to find yourself in a room with no doors, just 5 walls. The dining room is not pentangular to your memory, and you can't find the way you got in or the way you'll get out. You know, though, that the kitchen is on the southeast, so you approach that side of the room. You hear kitchen sounds and the music getting louder as you get closer. Feeling your way along the wall, you call out to the spouse, who says they'll be right there. You are pressing against the wall, trying to find a door seam along it, when suddenly a press and a click reveals a Dutch door, and then you remember, of course, I remember installing this years ago. Relieved, you swing both halves out and you step into the kitchen. The spouse is merrily working away at the mountain of black pans, black pots, black cooking sheets, and other more exotic, all large, all black dishes that are piled in the sink. In your left hand is your water bottle, and you feel very thirsty. Fortunately, your faucet can extend from the pipe, so you do so, filling your water bottle while asking your spouse if they can hear that music, apologizing if it is yours. They don't seem to be concerned by it, and you walk around them to get to the landing. On your left, a dozen stairs lead up to the second floor, but didn't they also go down to the basement? No matter. Most concerning at this moment is a strange sculpture hanging about waist-high over the third step. It is roughly spherical, consisting of what look to be strips of cardboard gray with age. They are woven or perhaps glued together in such a way that they almost suggest a Moebius strip. Stepping along the sphere, you think, as though an extraterrestrial behemoth conquering a planet, a spider, iridescently hued with blue and green markings, crawls over, within, and through the sculpture, trailing gossamer silk which is deposited in the hundreds, no thousands of corners of the thing. You also see the arachnid eggs it has laid, hanging precariously from the bottom. Hey, we have to work on getting rid of this, you say, because you've seen this same structure before, and are tired of scooting around it while trying to descend the stairs. You turn around, and on your right, your spouse's left. You see another small spider. This one is different from the one in the sculpture, though. It is plain gray, with markings on its sternum that you remember from the book you read from the school's library as a youth. This spider does not belong here. It is native to the rainforests of Brazil, and though not aggressive, is extremely poisonous. Watch out for the spider on your left, my right, you call out, and then you look up. In the east corner of the landing, you see a series of wasps' nests, paper crowding the corner. Though you can't see me, I am there regarding you with twitching antennae and compound eyes multiplying you. I hear you call out to your spouse that there are more wasps' nests now, for my colony grows. I take flight, and you don't see me buzzing behind your head. But you hear the buzzing now, at intervals, becoming the alarm, waking you from this dream. Your hand swings and knocks the clock to the ground. It explodes into metal, wires, and gears, and from behind its face, I crawl out, trailed by dozens of green aphids that crawl into your bed, staining it green as you thrash and smash at them in a half-daze. The room starts to smell like mowed grass. While distracted, I crawl up your arm, leaving a trail of scabs in my wake. The venom begins to paralyze you. Your body is now under my control. I creep up your neck, onto your face, and stare with alien intelligence into your own widening, terrified eyes. You scream, and my brethren burst out, spilling over your tongue, down your chest, and I prepare to bore my last sting into your pineal gland. And now you're mine. In the fields, up for grabs, one phantasmic entity named Emily. Emily's talents include housework, empathetic listening, and laundry. Elephantine trunks make quick cleanup for most common spills and messes. Intruders will be put off by crustacean claws, which will subdue them until the proper authorities arrive. Emily prefers lights to be dim in the house. Please ensure that all light bulbs are no more than 10 watts in output. Emily feeds on television broadcasts of golf and cooking shows. Recommended viewing time of 2 hours minimum per day to keep Emily to a reasonable size. Over 6 hours of viewing per day may result in damage to walls and the roof. Please cover all mirrored surfaces in the house, for Emily taking sight of herself may result in catastrophic rages. If interested, please contact the Fields Corporation via certified mail with "Attention, Emily up for grabs" on the envelope, and enclose a money order for $100 shipping and handling. No refunds offered. First come, first served. And now some words in verse. Dying unspoken thoughts of Mozart composing an unheard symphony. Terrible colors tremble, bass treble, all linked like dancing sausages, forthcoming beads of oily sweat. Extinguish! Taken, embraced like a colic baby, bruised, beaten to bloody pulp, on witch stump cackle, fire flame lick roast crisp burn. Angels mourning harmonic hymn in stained glass chapels. Hallelujah, we are doomed. Runny eggs off plate dream dawn drawn. Drown me in honey-soaked throat burst. Harm done turnkey soul love. They'll hear my beauty yet. Dum da 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 descending. A rotund woman ululating in Latin over the farm boy. She loves but cannot. Laundry steam, sweat smell, and maybe toasted bread? I can't say, sing, shout, with those salty standing tears streaming down my powdered cheeks. Candle snuff smother forms, a melody in the air, perform tooting with a horn, French perhaps a bugle. Now shifting colors dance bulging, popping into others, heed thin flushes like champagne, effervescently tickling my nose. Beneath, under brothers, boils, bushes, brambles, a thick, dank water. Slowly heat bursts through, respiration reality tough. Mommy, is it time to play? Plucking strings of harpsichord, so pleasant the turning tummy my pressure creates. Birdsong, muting into whale bursts. I haven't heard but heard of. Beneath other sea monsters, let's see. Squid, walrus, flat-headed shark. Now a sound for dawn. How to recreate the golden orb rising from the edge of the world, setting horizon aflame. Never mind that hold this rogue, roll crackling, creaking spring year. Spring, sprung, stretch, there! That roll, hoary and omnipedal obfutition, beautiful. We now bring you sage advice and fortunes based on your zodiacal sign. Scorpio. You're awakened at night by a distant clicking, like claws opening and closing. It is getting closer. Then you realize it is coming from inside of you. And now, Fiction Corner. Walt was the newest hire in the inventory offices of the Fields Corporation, having been on the team for nearly 9 months. He had visited a few of the Fields facilities, noting the stock and presenting his reports to his one-up. He did fine work, and while he knew the job was not what he wanted to make a career of, it was not too taxing and helped to pay the bills. After working on some spreadsheets Friday afternoon, he read an email informing him that his next assignment was going to take about 3 days at a furniture showroom in Rank. The name of the store was Emporium Crepuscular, and he was to arrive at 7 p.m. next Monday. An odd time to do an inventory check, but it was all right. Walt was young and had nothing tying him down to the 9-to-5 workday routine. He noted the address, referred to some maps to determine the expected commute time, and made his plan to arrive at the store next Monday evening. Walt arrived at the store Monday at 7 p.m., punctual as always, and taking a free space on the mostly deserted streets of Rank. The store was located in a plaza, full of other stores whose windows were darkened. A candy store, a wine store. On the surface, there was nothing indicating Emporium Crepuscular was any different, aside from the dusty and dim windows, illuminated by a dull glow of overhead lights. Printed on the door was, Emporium Crepuscular, furnishings, curios, and more. Hours, Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday, 8 p.m. to 1 p.m. or by appointment. He opened the door, and it was accompanied by a tinny tinkle, the bell sounding its alarum as the door swung open. The light inside somehow was even dimmer, and there was all manner of shadows around every corner. As he stood in the alcove, Walt took out his ledger and began to note some of the items he could make out. Out of the shadows stepped a thin man in a brown suit, who introduced himself as the manager, Mr. Horm. Mr. Horm wore dark sunglasses, which had Walt wondering if the man was blind. He moved sinuously, though, as he led Walt into the showroom proper. It was much larger than he had anticipated from the outside, and there was a persistent gloom that hung like fog over the entire store. Dim orange globes of light fought helplessly against the dark, and it had the appearance of a couple dozen desert suns setting across the showroom floor. He took out a penlight from his sport coat, but when Walt turned it on, Mr. Horm hissed and exclaimed, "Extinguish that loathsome thing. The light here is adequate for your work." Walt hastened to turn the light off, finding Mr. Horm's objections to it strange. Perhaps he wasn't blind, but was just sensitive to the light. "You'll begin your inventory this evening on the ground floor here. Then, provided you complete your counts tonight, we'll have you down in the basement storage tomorrow evening and the next," Mr. Horm said. While he couldn't be sure of Mr. Horm's visual acuity, he did face Walt straight on. The expression on the rest of Mr. Horm's face was a blank slate, and he spoke almost robotically. After answering a couple questions of Mr. Horm, "Is the office satisfied with our business?" Walt guessed they were. He was, after all, a simple inventory man. "Is Bruce still in management?" Walt didn't know everyone's name above his one-up, so he shrugged noncommittedly. He excused himself to tend to some managerial matters, and Walt got to work. Around the showroom, Walt perambulated as though wading in the inky darkness. On the wall hung a fresco that appeared oriental in nature. The size was impressive, easily 5.5 feet tall and 2 feet wide. A placard hung below reading Cove Pin, 1845. A woman in reeds. $1,000. Staring straight ahead at the painting, the scene was bucolic. One could make out the green and golden reeds bent as though in a gentle wind. The woman was diminutive in comparison to the foliage. She wore a red silken robe covered in green dragons. Her countenance was bowed, as though looking down at the ground, and she held in her hand a small scythe that she appeared to be in mid-swing of. Walt could almost hear the lilt of a wooden flute as he stared at the tableau. He made his notations and then began to turn, when he stopped and looked again at the painting. A trick of the light perhaps, or the lack of light as it were, for now the painting had changed. Now it was an inferno, the plant life black and piled at the woman's feet. Among the dead reeds a pile of small bones as from an infant were scattered and smoking. The woman in the robe was now gone. In its place a crouching feral thing bared its teeth, a hideous rictus smeared in red. The sex of this bestial monster was obscured in the dim light, but it made Walt take a step back. He blinked once, then twice, then he moved his head, and the painting returned to its original form. Puzzled, he approached the painting and saw that in fact the painting was a primitive attempt at lenticular painting, where the paint had been heaped onto the canvas, allowing for an alternate view of the scene depending on where the viewer was situated. He shivered as he looked again at the two images sharing space, but depicting scenes so diametrically opposed. The hag in the horrific scene seemed to have fire in its eyes and stared at him hungrily. He finished his notes and moved along the pathway to the next item. The next several items seemed more banal. There was a coppery-looking wastebasket and wooden chairs of both the dining room and rocking variety. These he took down as he continued around the gloomy room. He approached one of the globular lights, and it appeared to be a living room set of high-back leather chairs. These were circling a lumpen object in the shadows which Walt actually found with his foot. The object yielded to his step with a spongy hiss. He couldn't quite make it out in the gloom, but when he touched it, he felt something like twine or hemp rope, perhaps. Also, something wet, as though with the consistency of paint. He rubbed his fingers together, and they felt slick as though with motor oil. He bent down again and found a card strung through the object which said Ottoman, $100. Given how the ottoman yielded to his foot, he couldn't believe it would be adequate as a place to rest one's feet. A smell was also apparent while he was bent down, like old kerosene. People buy some weird stuff, Walt thought to himself as he made the note on his inventory sheet. From another part of the store, distantly, he could hear the tolling of an old grandfather clock. It chimed 3 times and then stopped. Walt initially didn't think anything of this, but then glanced down at his own watch and saw, in fact, that several hours had passed, and it was now a couple of minutes past 3. That didn't seem right, he considered. Didn't I just arrive here? He looked at his ledger, and it too had many pages filled out. He didn't remember writing so much. Had he been sleepwalking? Before he could give it more thought, from the shadows strode Mr. Horm, who said, "I see that you've finished the first round of inventory. Fine work, Walt. Come, I'll bring your coat, and we'll see you tomorrow evening." Even though Walt was truly bewildered by the circumstance and curious as to how he had been taking inventory without being conscious of it, he found himself saying, "Thank you, Mr. Horm, and I'll see you tomorrow." He left the shop, the bell tinkling its goodbye, and as he made his way to his car, Walt felt his thoughts were like the paste in one's mouth after a night of one too many beers. That night, laying in bed, he was troubled by dreams populated with baby-eating witches dancing and gyrating to discordant flutes played in the distance. A cloaked figure approached him with a wet sack dripping with greasy fluids, and the light of a distant fire, swallowed by a black, foul-smelling smoke. Walt awoke late in the morning and dismissed his dreams as being a consequence of a bad meal the previous day. He was quite tired, but a couple of cups of coffee had him feeling functional, if not entirely rested, by late in the afternoon. After a light meal, with the sunlight of the day waning, he made his way back to the plaza and to the shop. He again opened the door and stepped in, with the tinkle of the bell announcing his entry. Mr. Horm again came out to the alcove, dark glasses still on his face. "All right, Walt, follow me to the basement for the next set of items. These are specialties for our elite customers," Mr. Horm said as they approached two narrow doors Walt didn't recall seeing before. Mr. Horm removed a ring of keys and opened the one on the right, which led to a staircase going down. The top of the staircase was narrow, so much so that even the average frame of Walt required him to turn a few degrees to begin his descent. As they walked down, the staircase became wider until, when they reached the bottom, there was easily enough space for them to walk side by side with adequate room. Mr. Horm gave a brass chain hanging from the ceiling a tug, and a dim light from a series of bulbs illuminated the area. "I will leave you to your work, Walt," Mr. Horm said as he turned around and ascended the staircase. There was plenty of clearance for Walt to walk without stooping, and again he was struck by the immensity of the space in the basement, even more so than on the ground floor. He took out his ledger and turned to a clean page, writing at the top, "Cellar Inventory." The light bulbs hung from gossamer thin wires and swayed as Walt walked under them among the aisles of artifacts. These threw inky pools of shadows which swum below him like a dark creek. To his right, he could just make out another high-backed chair that appeared to be missing a back leg as it sat at an unusual angle. The tag read, "Uncanny Recliner, $300. Walt wondered exactly what made a chair uncanny and decided to take a seat. As soon as he made contact, he found no matter what position he took, he was uncomfortable to the point of needing to move. He got up with no little effort and continued to take inventory of the stock. As Walt continued into the gloom, the staircase up to the main level was obscured in the dark. He thought he should have brought some little slips of paper to ensure he had a trail to find his way back. The labyrinth of strange items continued to bloom in front of him, branching off to the right and to the left. He decided to turn right, then left, then right again. Further treasures he encountered included a 9-inch cube containing a dark liquid. He held this aloft at the dim light and could see some object was suspended in it, but stubbornly eluded further investigation beyond the suggestion of an organ, a proboscis, perhaps a closed eye. He simply notated it as cube sculpture. There was no tag or other identifier on it. He set it down and moved on to the next item, a lamp shaped like a human hand. There was no shade on it, and each of the fingers, gnarled, appearing leathery and aged, terminated with a small bulb like those found on a string of Christmas lights. Hand of Glory lamp, $500, read its tag. Further into the stacks, the object he saw defied categorization, and the labels were no help, written in Cyrillic letters that Walt had no familiarity with. In spite of his eyes becoming more accustomed to the dim light, the inventory he was tasked with taking resisted easy discernment. They almost seemed to actively recede from Walt, sinking into the shadows as he bent to examine them. Some of his notes simply read, "a shape." Near the terminus of one of the paths, an intriguing shadow beckoned to Walt, though his amygdala dumped epinephrine into his system in alarm. His senses heightened. He could hear footsteps above him, smell a dank, fungal odor, and the shadows took on a tangible texture as he moved the object away from the shadow. A riot of sensations churned and fought in Walt's consciousness. All of the senses so heightened a moment ago were dark and inaccessible. The perception he had was floating, though he also seemed to be immobile. The last thing he recalled was moving a boxy object to get a glimpse of something. As he tried to recall what it was as though he encountered a snowy television signal obscuring his memory of it. In his mind's eye, he could only recollect that the shadow shifted unnaturally as he approached. The riot of sensations slowly resolved itself, and Walt's consciousness began to wane, until all that remained was a black drone of impressions pressing and smothering Walt's conscious mind. Rising out of the dream state, Walt became aware of light fighting a losing battle against wooden slats. Dust hung in a miasma, particles floating and descending in the rays. Around him, Walt perceived several objects covered in tarp. He attempted to move, but no change in his position resulted. He became frustrated and strained to look around. Against the wall, he could just make out a tall, maybe 6 feet, object with a sheet hung over it. It seemed as though he was peering through prescription glasses that distorted the room around him. There was then the intimation of sound, creaking steps approaching from the left? Below? Direction and his orientation were just as difficult to ascertain. Up until now, he thought he was still in the basement. But was there a lower level still? That didn't explain the light bleeding in from outside, though. The steps came closer, more than one set of shoes on the wooden floor. The sense of a presence of 2 people behind him speaking in low tones. One of them, who he now recognized as Mr. Horm, saying, "And this is one of our new acquisitions, Daniel, a curiosity suspended in depression glass." The other figure, Daniel, came into view, his face bearing an expression between disgust and fascination. His face, distorted by the imperfections in the glass which Walt realized encased him. He made to scream, but there was no sound. Daniel and Mr. Horm walked on, Walt sending an impulse to pound on the glass that went unheeded. The glass became slightly clouded in response to his agitation. Mr. Horm took the sheet off of the object against the wall, which turned out to be a tall wardrobe mirror. Walt caught a glimpse of his predicament, and his mind reeled. Floating in a brackish fluid was a pair of eyes, Walt's own, and a clump of organic material, which he realized was an amalgamation of his brain, and the necessary organs to keep him in a state of suspended animation. His mind broke, and he soundlessly screamed at the abominable sight long after the footfalls faded, and the light receded. Another item for sale to a wealthy patron at Emporium Crepuscular. The Doll's Ghost by Frances Marion Crawford. It was a terrible accident, and for one moment the splendid machinery of Cranston House got out of gear and stood still. The butler emerged from the retirement in which he spent his elegant leisure. 2 grooms of the chambers appeared simultaneously from opposite directions. There were actually housemaids on the grand staircase, and those who remember the facts most exactly assert that Mrs. Pringle herself positively stood upon the landing. Mrs. Pringle was the housekeeper. As for the head nurse, the under-nurse, and the nursery maid, their feelings cannot be described. The head nurse laid one hand upon the polished marble balustrade and stared stupidly before her. The under-nurse stood rigid and pale, leaning against the polished marble wall, and the nursery maid collapsed and sat down upon the polished marble step, just beyond the limits of the velvet carpet, and frankly burst into tears. The lady, Gwendolen Lancaster Douglas Scroop, youngest daughter of the 9th Duke of Cranston, and aged 6 years and 3 months, picked herself up quite alone, and sat down on the 3rd step from the foot of the grand staircase in Cranston House. "Oh," ejaculated the butler, and he disappeared again. "Ah," responded the grooms of the chambers, and they also went away. "It's only that doll," Mrs. Pringle was distinctly heard to say in a tone of contempt. The under-nurse heard her say it. Then the three nurses gathered round Lady Gwendolen and patted her, and gave her unhealthy things out of their pockets, and hurried her out of Cranston House as fast as they could, lest it should be found upstairs that they had allowed the Lady Gwendolen Lancaster Douglas group to tumble down the grand staircase with her doll in her arms. And as the doll was badly broken, the nursery maid carried it, with the pieces, wrapped up in Lady Gwendolen's little cloak. It was not far to Hyde Park, and when they had reached a quiet place, they took means to find out that Lady Gwendolen had no bruises, for the carpet was very thick and soft, and there was thick stuff under it to make it softer. Lady Gwendolen Douglas Group sometimes yelled, but she never cried. It was because she had yelled that the nurse had allowed her to go downstairs alone with Nina, the doll, under one arm, while she steadied herself with her other hand on the balustrade, and trod upon the polished marble steps beyond the edge of the carpet. So she had fallen, and Nina had come to grief. When the nurses were quite sure that she was not hurt, they unwrapped the doll and looked at her in her turn. She had been a very beautiful doll, very large and fair and healthy, with real yellow hair and eyelids that would open and shut over very grown-up dark eyes. Moreover, when you moved her right arm up and down, she said, "Papa," and when you moved the left, she said, "Mama," very distinctly. "I heard her say pa when she fell," said the under-nurse, who heard everything, "but she ought to have said papa." "That's because her arm went up when she hit the step," said the head nurse. "She'll say the other pa when I put it down again," said Nina, and her right arm was pushed down, and, speaking through her broken face, it was cracked right across from the upper corner of the forehead with a hideous gash through the nose and down to the little frilled collar of the pale green silk Mother Hubbard frock, and two little three-cornered pieces of porcelain had fallen out. "I'm sure it's a wonder she can speak at all at being all smashed," said the under-nurse. "You'll have to take her to Mr. Puckler," said her superior. "It's not far, and you'd better go at once." Lady Gwendolen was occupied in digging a hole in the ground with a little spade, and paid no attention to the nurses. "What are you doing?" inquired the nursery maid, looking on. "Nina's dead, and I'm digging her a grave," replied her ladyship thoughtfully. "Oh, she'll come to life again, all right," said the nursery maid. The under-nurse wrapped Nina up again and departed. Fortunately, a kind soldier with very long legs and a very small cap happened to be there, and as he had nothing to do, he offered to see the under-nurse safely to Mr. Puckler's and back. Mr. Bernard Puckler and his little daughter lived in a little house in a little alley, which led out off a quiet little street not very far from Belgrave Square. He was the great doll doctor, and his extensive practice lay in the most aristocratic quarter. He mended dolls of all sizes and ages, boys' dolls and girl dolls, baby dolls in long clothes and grown-up dolls in fashionable gowns, talking dolls and dumb dolls, those that shut their eyes when they lay down, and those whose eyes had to be shut for them by means of a mysterious wire. His daughter Elsie was only just over 12 years old, but she was already very clever at mending dolls' clothes, and at doing their hair, which is harder than you might think, though the dolls sit quite still while it is being done. Mr. Puckler had originally been German, but he had dissolved his nationality in the ocean of London many years ago, like a great many foreigners. He still had one or two German friends, however, who came on Saturday evenings and smoked with him and played piquet or scat with him for farthing points, and called him Herr Doctor, which seemed to please Mr. Puckler very much. He looked older than he was, for his beard was rather long and ragged, his hair was grizzled and thin, and he wore horn-rimmed spectacles. As for Elsie, she was a thin, pale child, very quiet and neat, with dark eyes and brown hair that was plaited down her back and tied with a bit of black ribbon. She mended the dolls' clothes and took the dolls back to their homes when they were quite strong again. The house was a little one, but too big for the two people who lived in it. There was a small sitting room on the street, and the workshop was at the back, and there were 3 rooms upstairs. But the father and daughter lived most of their time in the workshop because they were generally at work, even in the evenings. Mr. Puckler laid Nina on the table and looked at her a long time, till the tears began to fill his eyes behind the horn-rimmed spectacles. He was a very susceptible man, and he often fell in love with the dolls he mended, and found it hard to part with them when they had smiled at him for a few days. They were real little people to him, with characters and thoughts and feelings of their own, and he was very tender with them all. But some attracted him especially from the first, and when they were brought to him maimed and injured, their state seemed so pitiful to him that the tears came easily. You must remember that he lived among dolls during a great part of his life, and understood them. "How do you know that they feel nothing?" he went on to say to Elsie. "You must be gentle with them. It costs nothing to be kind to the little beings, and perhaps it makes a difference to them." And Elsie understood him, because she was a child, and she knew that she was more to him than all the dolls. He fell in love with Nina at first sight, perhaps because her beautiful brown glass eyes were something like Elsie's own, and he loved Elsie first and best with all his heart. And besides, it was a very sorrowful case. Nina had evidently not been long in the world, for her complexion was perfect, her hair was smooth where it should be smooth, and curly where it should be curly, and her silk clothes were perfectly new. But across her face was that frightful gash, like a saber cut, deep and shadowy within, but clean and sharp at the edges. When he tenderly pressed her head to close the gaping wound, the edges made a fine grating sound. It was painful to hear, and the lids of the dark eyes quivered and trembled as though Nina were suffering dreadfully. "Poor Nina," he exclaimed sorrowfully, "but I shall not hurt you much, though you will take a long time to get strong." He always asked the names of the broken dolls when they were brought to him, and sometimes the people knew what the children had called them, and told him. He liked Nina for a name. Altogether and in every way, she pleased him more than any doll he had seen for many years, and he felt drawn to her, and made up his mind to make her perfectly strong and sound, no matter how much labor it might cost him. Mr. Puckler worked patiently a little at a time, and Elsie watched him. She could do nothing for poor Nina, whose clothes needed no mending. The longer the doll doctor worked, the more fond he became of the yellow hair and the beautiful brown glass eyes. He sometimes forgot all the other dolls that were waiting to be mended, lying side by side on a shelf, and sat for an hour gazing at Nina's face, while he racked his ingenuity for some new invention by which to hide even the smallest trace of the terrible accident. She was wonderfully mended. Even he was obliged to admit that, but the scar was still visible to his keen eyes, a very fine line right across the face, downwards from right to left. Yet all the conditions had been most favorable for a cure, since the cement had set quite hard at the first attempt, and the weather had been fine and dry, which makes a great difference in a doll's hospital. At last, he knew that he could do no more, and the undernurse had already come twice to see whether the job was finished, as she coarsely expressed it. "Nina is not quite strong yet," Mr. Puckler had answered each time, for he could not make up his mind to face the parting. And now he sat before the square deal table at which he worked, and Nina lay before him for the last time with a big brown paper box beside her. It stood there like her coffin, waiting for her, he thought. He must put her into it and lay tissue paper over her dear face, and then put on the lid, and at the thought of tying the string his sight was dim with tears again. He was never to look into the glassy depths of the beautiful brown eyes any more, nor to hear the little wooden voice say, "Papa," and "Mama." It was a very painful moment. In the vain hope of gaining time before the separation, he took up the little sticky bottles of cement and glue and gum and color, looking at each one in turn and then at Nina's face. And all his small tools lay there, neatly arranged in a row, but he knew that he could not use them again for Nina. She was quite strong at last, and in a country where there should be no cruel children to hurt her, she might live 100 years, with only that almost imperceptible line across her face to tell of the fearful thing that had befallen her on the marble steps of Cranston House. Suddenly, Mr. Puckler's heart was quite full, and he rose abruptly from his seat and turned away. "Elsie," he said unsteadily, "you must do it for me. I cannot bear to see her go into the box." So he went and stood at the window with his back turned, while Elsie did what he had not the heart to do. "Is it done?" he asked, not turning round. "Then take her away, my dear. Put on your hat, and take her to Cranston House quickly, and when you are gone I will turn round." Elsie was used to her father's queer ways with the dolls, and though she had never seen him so much moved by a parting, she was not much surprised. "Come back quickly," he said, when he heard her hand on the latch. "It is growing late, and I should not send you at this hour, but I cannot bear to look forward to it any more." When Elsie was gone, he left the window and sat down in his place before the table again, to wait for the child to come back. He touched the place where Nina had lain very gently, and he recalled the softly tinted pink face, and the glass eyes, and the ringlets of yellow hair, till he could almost see them. The evenings were long, for it was late in the spring. But it began to grow dark soon, and Mr. Puckler wondered why Elsie had not come back. She had been gone an hour and a half, and that was much longer than he had expected, for it was barely a half-mile from Belgrave Square to Cranston House. He reflected that the child might have been kept waiting, but as the twilight deepened he grew anxious, and walked up and down in the dim workshop, no longer thinking of Nina, but of Elsie, his own living child, whom he loved. An undefinable, disquieting sensation came upon him by fine degrees, a chilliness and a faint stirring of his thin hair, joined with a wish to be in any company rather than be alone much longer. It was the beginning of fear. He told himself in strong German English that he was a foolish man, and he should begin to feel about for the matches in the dusk. He knew just where they should be, for he always kept them in the same place, close to the little tin box that held bits of sealing wax of various colors, for some kinds of mending. But somehow he could not find the matches in the gloom.
Something had happened to Elsie, he was sure, and as his fear increased, he felt as though he might be allayed if he could get a light and see what time it was. Then he called himself a foolish old man again, and the sound of his own voice startled him in the dark. He could not find the matches. The window was gray still. He might see what time it was if he went close to it, and he could go and get matches out of the cupboard afterwards. He stood back from the table to get out of the way of the chair, and began to cross the board floor. Something was following him in the dark. There was a small pattering, as of tiny feet upon the boards. He stopped and listened, and the roots of his hair tingled. It was nothing, and he was a foolish old man. He made 2 steps more, and he was sure that he heard the little pattering again. He turned his back to the window, leaning against the sash so that the panes began to crack, and he faced the dark. Everything was quite still, and it smelt of paint and cement and wood filings as usual. "Is that you, Elsie?" he asked, and he was surprised by the fear in his voice. There was no answer in the room, and he held up his watch and tried to make out what time it was by the gray dusk that was just not darkness. So far as he could see, it was within 2 or 3 minutes of 10 o'clock. He had been a long time alone. He was shocked and frightened for Elsie, out in London so late, and he almost ran across the room to the door. As he fumbled for the latch, he distinctly heard the running of little feet after him. "Mice!" he exclaimed feebly, just as he got the door open. He shut it quickly behind him, and felt as though some cold thing had settled on his back and were writhing upon him. The passage was quite dark, but he found his hat and was out in the alley in a moment, breathing more freely, and surprised to find how much light there still was in the open air. He could see the pavement clearly under his feet, and far off in the street to which the alley led, he could hear the laughter and calls of children playing some game out of doors. He wondered how he could have been so nervous, and for an instant he thought of going back into the house to wait quietly for Elsie. But instantly he felt that nervous fright of something stealing over him again. In any case, it was better to walk up to Cranston House and ask the servants about the child. One of the women had perhaps taken a fancy to her, and was even now giving her tea and cake. He walked quickly to Belgrave Square, and then up the broad streets, listening as he went, whenever there was no other sound, for the tiny footsteps. But he heard nothing, and was laughing at himself when he rang the servants' bell of the big house. Of course, the child must be there. The person who opened the door was quite an inferior person, for it was a back door, but affected the manners of the front, and stared at Mr. Puckler superciliously under the strong light. No little girl had been seen, and he knew nothing about no dolls. "She is my little girl," said Mr. Puckler tremulously, for all his anxiety was returning tenfold, "and I am afraid something has happened." The inferior person said rudely that nothing could have happened to her in that house, because she had not been there, which was a jolly good reason why. And Mr. Puckler was obliged to admit that the man ought to know, as it was his business to keep the door and let people in. He wished to be allowed to speak to the under-nurse who knew him, but the man was ruder than ever, and finally shut the door in his face. When the doll doctor was alone in the street, he steadied himself by the railing, for he felt as though he were breaking in two, just as some dolls break in the middle of the backbone. Presently, he knew that he must be doing something to find Elsie, and that gave him strength. He began to walk as quickly as he could through the streets, following every highway and byway which his little girl might have taken on her errand. He also asked several policemen in vain if he had seen her, and most of them answered him kindly, for they saw that he was a sober man and in his right senses, and some of them had little girls of their own. It was 1 o'clock in the morning when he went up to his own door again, worn out and hopeless and broken-hearted. As he turned the key in the lock, his heart stood still, for he knew that he was awake and not dreaming, and that he really heard those tiny footsteps pattering to meet him inside the house along the passage. But he was too unhappy to be frightened any more, and his heart went on again with a dull, regular pain that found its way all through him with every pulse. So he went in and hung up his hat in the dark, and found the matches in the cupboard and the candlestick in its place in the corner. Mr. Puckler was so much overcome and so completely worn out that he sat down in his chair before the work table and almost fainted, as his face dropped forward upon his folded hands. Beside him, the solitary candle burned steadily with a low flame in the still warm air. "Elsie, Elsie," he moaned against his yellow knuckles. And that was all he could say, and it was no relief to him. On the contrary, the very sound of the name was a new and sharp pain that pierced his ears and his head and his very soul. For every time he repeated the name, it meant that little Elsie was dead, somewhere out in the streets of London in the dark. He was so incredibly hurt that he did not even feel something pulling gently at the skirt of his old coat, so gently that it was like the nibblings of a tiny mouse. He might have thought that it was really a mouse if he had noticed it. "Elsie, Elsie," he groaned right against his hands. Then a cool breath stirred his thin air, and the low flame of the one candle dropped down almost to a mere spark, not flickering as though a draught were going to blow it out, but just dropping down as if it were tired out. Mr. Puckler felt his hands stiffening with fright under his face, and there was a faint rustling sound, like some small silk thing blown in a gentle breeze. He sat up straight, stark and scared, and a small wooden voice spoke in the stillness.
Papa,
It said, with a break between the syllables. Mr. Puckler stood up in a single jump, and his chair fell over backwards, with a smashing noise upon the wooden floor. The candle had almost gone out. It was Nina's doll that had spoken, and he should have known it among the voices of 100 other dolls. And yet there was something more in it, a little human ring, with a pitiful cry and call for help, and the wail of a hurt child. Mr. Puckler stood up, stark and stiff, and tried to look round, but at first he could not, for he seemed to be frozen from head to foot. Then he made a great effort, and he raised one hand to each of his temples, and pressed his own head round as he would have turned a doll's. The candle was burning so low that it might as well have been out altogether for any light it gave, and the room seemed quite dark at first. Then he saw something. He would not have believed that he could be more frightened than he had been just before that, but he was, and his knees shook, for he saw the doll standing in the middle of the floor, shining with a faint and ghostly radiance, her beautiful glassy brown eyes fixed on his, and across her face the very thin line of the break he had mended shone as though it were drawn in a light with a fine point of white flame. Yet there was something more in the eyes, too. There was something human, like Elsie's own, but as if only the doll saw him through them, and not Elsie. And there was enough of Elsie to bring back all his pain, and to make him forget his fear. "Elsie, my little Elsie!" he cried aloud. The small ghost moved, and its doll arm slowly rose and fell with a stiff, mechanical motion.
Papa,
It said. It seemed, this time, that there was even more of Elsie's tone echoing somewhere between the wooden notes that reached his ears so distinctly, yet so far away. Elsie was calling him, he was sure. His face was perfectly white in the gloom, but his knees did not shake any more, and he felt that he was less frightened. "Yes, child, but where? Where?" he asked. "Where are you, Elsie?"
Papa,
The syllables died away again in the quiet room. There was a low rustling of silk, the glassy brown eyes turned slowly away, and Mr. Puckler heard the pitter-patter of the small feet in the bronze kid slippers as the figure ran straight to the door. Then the candle burned high again, and the room was full of light, and he was alone. Mr. Puckler passed his hand over his eyes and looked about him. He could see everything quite clearly, and he felt that he must have been dreaming, though he was standing instead of sitting down, and he should have been if he had just waked up. The candle burned brightly now. There were the dolls to be mended, lying in a row with their toes up. The third one had lost her right shoe, and Elsie was making one. He knew that, and he was certainly not dreaming now. He had not been dreaming when he had come in from his fruitless search and heard the doll's footsteps running to the door. He had not fallen asleep in his chair. How could he possibly have fallen asleep when his heart was breaking? He had been awake all the time. He steadied himself, set the fallen chair upon its legs, and said to himself again very emphatically that he was a foolish old man. He ought to be out in the streets looking for his child, asking questions, and inquiring at the police stations where all accidents were reported as soon as they were known, or at the hospitals.
Papa,
The longing, wailing, pitiful little wooden cry rang from the passage outside the door, and Mr. Puckler stood for an instant with white face transfixed and rooted to the spot. A moment later, his hand was on the latch. Then he was in the passage, with the light streaming from the open door behind him. Quite at the other end he saw the little phantom shining clearly in the shadow, and the right hand seemed to beckon to him as the arm rose and fell once more. He knew all at once that it had not come to frighten him, but to lead him, and when it disappeared he walked boldly towards the door. He knew that it was in the street outside waiting for him. He forgot that he was tired and had eaten no supper, and had walked many miles, for a sudden hope ran through and through him like a golden stream of life. And sure enough, at the corner of the alley, and at the corner of the street, and out in Belgrave Square, he saw the small ghost flitting before him. Sometimes it was only a shadow, where there was other light, but then the glare of the lamps made a pale green sheen on its little Mother Hubbard frock of silk. And sometimes, where the streets were dark and silent, the whole figure shone out brightly, with its yellow curls and rosy neck. It seemed to trot along like a tiny child, and Mr. Puckler could almost hear the pattering of the bronze kid slippers on the pavement as it ran. But it went very fast, and he could only just keep up with it, tearing along with his hat on the back of his head and his thin brown hair blown by the night breeze, and his horn-rimmed spectacles firmly set upon his broad nose. On and on he went, and he had no idea where he was. He did not even care, for he knew certainly that he was going the right way. Then at last, in a wide, quiet street, he was standing before a big, sober-looking door that had 2 lamps on each side of it, and a polished brass bell handle which he pulled. And just inside, when the door was opened, in the bright light, there was the little shadow, and the pale green sheen of the little silk dress. And once more the small cry came to his ears, less pitiful, more longing.
Papa.
The shadow turned suddenly bright, and out of the brightness the beautiful brown glass eyes were turned up happily to his, while the rosy mouth smiled so divinely that the phantom doll looked almost like a little angel just then. A little girl was brought in soon after 10 o'clock, said the quiet voice of the hospital doorkeeper. I think they thought she was only stunned. She was holding a big brown paper box against her, and they could not get it out of her arms. She had a long plait of brown hair that hung down as they carried her. She is my little girl, said Mr. Puckler, but he hardly heard his own voice. He leaned over Elsie's face in the gentle light of the children's ward, and when he had stood there a minute, the beautiful brown eyes opened and looked up to his. Papa, cried Elsie softly, I knew you would come. Then Mr. Puckler did not know what he did or said for a moment, and what he felt was worth all the fear and terror and despair that had almost killed him that night. But by and by, Elsie was telling her story, and the nurse let her speak, for there were only 2 other children in the room, who were getting well and were sound asleep. They were big boys and had bad faces, said Elsie, and they tried to get Nina away from me, but I held on and fought as well as I could till one of them hit me with something, and I don't remember any more, for I tumbled down, and I suppose the boys ran away and somebody found me there. But I'm afraid Nina is all smashed. Here is the box, said the nurse. We could not take it out of her arms till she came to herself. Should you like to see if the doll is broken? And she undid the string cleverly, but Nina was all smashed to pieces. Only the gentle light of the children's ward made a pale green sheen in the folds of the little Mother Hubbard frock.
The Curriculum of Opprobian Motunides by Michael Cavagnaro. In an epoch long past, the great sage Agoribus Motunides wrought his many labors in secret, his power known solely to an elect, awed few. Yet among his myriad accomplishments, only Tuo Urem, his son, brought him any likeness of joy. Agoribus had himself received training from birth in a progressive course of cosmic study handed down from his father, Opprobian Motunides. Agoribus, in consultation with this curriculum, therefore resolved to demonstrate for his own heir the process by which a corpse, when obtained at a precise moment of passing, might be returned to the living. The climax of this lesson was dramatic. Agoribus would slay Tuo Urem and immediately bring him back to life. Opprobian had demonstrated the simplicity of a corresponding exercise when Agoribus was a child. There was little true peril. Nevertheless, wise Agoribus chose not to apprise the Whiff Motunides in advance of this exercise, as it would only serve to magnify for her the resplendence of her agonies. And so, before the wide-eyed and cherubic Tuo Urem, Agoribus furnished an easel whose burden was shrouded from view. In a pitch-darkened room, he had at an obscene hour scrawled upon that lambskin canvas an accurate representation of the physical anatomy of the Godhead, taking great pains not to conceive of it in its entirety in his own mind's eye. The adept elucidated, Upon survey of the effigy inscribed herein, thy flesh shall expire, and all bodily functions shall cease. Tuo Urem, son of mine, notify thy doting father when thou art readied. The boy indicated his assent with an austere nod, and following a gesture from Agoribus, one of their mindless servants removed the veil. Tuo Urem perished wrathfully but quickly. At once, Agoribus sprang into action with his tinctures and his vowel book. Within a few moments the arcane procedure was complete, and he had restored the boy's mortality with few obvious ill effects. After a brief review of the fundamentals and some note-taking upon how to further expedite the result, Agoribus and Tuo Urem were prepared to proceed to the next lesson of the day. And this they would have done, but for the Tramontane caller who emerged from an interplanar portal, forsaking all heraldry. Oedipus the Deiroian now profaned the sanctum of Agoribus, accompanied as ever by the fetor which is its hallmark. Effortlessly, august and courtly, Oedipus detailed its grievance succinctly in the infernal tongue. Thy son's spirit was briefly consigned to a chamber in the gnashing stomach of our womb colon, We found the sensation to be extremely pleasurable. Alas, we have discovered that our property has been unjustly removed. We wish to claim restitution, and thereby to restore that sensation which we found to be so agreeable. Agoribus felt this request upon its face to be objectionable, and proffered a reluctant counter. And that is how Agoribus Motunides aimed to reside for a year and a century in the gizzard of an arch-kobold. The whiff Motunides had barely time to doff her morning regalia for something a bit more cheerful when she discovered a freshly vital Agoribus taking a midnight repast whilst overlooking the twilit arboretum. She stalked off without an exchange of greetings, and Agoribus was thankful for that smallest of mercies. The following day, Agoribus and Curriuculum recommenced their esoteric studies with renewed vigor. "I bring salutations from Opprobian Motunides himself," announced father to son. "I have discovered that we shared identical accommodations. We were separated by the decades, yet time passeth strangely between the realms." Curriuculum lacked understanding, but a certain annihilation within the eye of Agoribus held back the vast deluge of his questioning. The moment passed, and Agoribus placed one unsteady hand upon the head of his son. "Verily, 'twould seem that my own circuit of Opprobian's curriculum is not yet complete.
And now I bid you a restless night. May you cower in the corner until morning's light. And in the harsh daylight you will see no one really gets out of jail free."
Thank you for listening to the Get Out of Jail Free Radio Hour. The Get Out of Jail Free Radio Hour was written, produced, edited, and uploaded by Matt Henshaw, except as indicated.